Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming, and welcome to the Smart on Crimes briefing on public safety, fiscal responsibility, and the administration of justice, lessons from the state. I'm really honored and very lucky to have with me four very distinguished panelists. To my far right, Justice I. Beverly Lake is former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, a former North Carolina State Senator, and the founder of the North Carolina Actual Innocence Commission. And joining him is Chris Muma, who is the former Executive Director of the Actual Innocence Commission. To my direct right is A.T. Wall. He's the Director of Rhode Island Department of Corrections. He's currently the longest serving corrections director in the nation and is president of the Association of State Correctional Administrators. To my direct left is Dr. Ann Morrison-Peel. Dr. Peel is Associate Professor of Economics and Director of the Program in Criminal Justice at Rutgers University and a Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And to my far right, David Keene, who is the former chairman of the American Conservative Union. He serves on the board of directors for the Constitution Project and is an original signatory of Right on Crime. Mr. Keene is recognized as one of the chief spokesmen for conservative principles and policies. I'm Christopher DeRocher. I'm the Government Affairs Counsel for the Constitution Project. This past February, the bipartisan Smart on Crime Coalition, which includes over 36 of the nation's leading criminal justice policy organizations, issued Smart on Crime recommendations for the administration and Congress. The coalition based this comprehensive reform roadmap on the conviction that the criminal justice system should be cost-efficient, accurate, effective, proven, and above all else, fair. The report covers virtually every major criminal justice issue, from the creation of new criminal laws, to skyrocketing incarceration rates and costs, to the reentry of ex-offenders into their communities, from helping to restore and empower victims, to identifying ways to protect the rights of the accused. We couldn't help but be aware as we prepared this report of the massive strain the economic downturn is having on federal and state budgets. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, states had to close a budget gap of $84 billion in 2011. Since the start of the recession, states have closed over $425 billion in budget shortfalls, and the outlook for 2012 and 2013 isn't any better. At this point, we don't know when states will be able to dig themselves out from under the Great Recession. At the same time, criminal justice expenditures are creating a huge burden on budgets. In 2008, federal, state, and local governments spent approximately $62 billion on corrections alone. And if changes are not made in the next 5 years, that number will increase by $27 billion. In 2011, the federal government is projected to spend over $4 billion supplementing the spending that states do for criminal justice, including law enforcement, prosecution, and other functions. Unfortunately for states, billions of dollars in federal criminal justice grants that were included as part of the 2009 stimulus bill expire this year, leaving states with even less money to address the budget gaps and to address their criminal justice and public safety needs. For that reason, the nearly 100 recommendations contained in Smart on Crime promote policies that provide the leaders and practitioners in the trenches, the public defenders, the prosecutors, judges, prison officials, and lawmakers, with the tools to address specific problems in the face of the unique challenges presented during these difficult economic times. We also recognize the importance of accountability in criminal justice systems as the state and federal governments seek to reduce spending. And whether they like it or not, many states are learning the lesson that tough on crime can fail if they don't take a critical look at the effectiveness and efficiency of their policies. Last month's Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Plata regarding prison overcrowding taught California a painful lesson about what happens when a state's tough on crime policies are confronted with today's budget realities. Regardless of whether you agree or disagree with the court's decision, the reality is that the status quo is unsustainable. The Chief Justice of Missouri, William Ray Price Jr., called for a move from anger-based sentencing that ignores cost and effectiveness to evidence-based sentencing that focuses on results. And he recognized that states across the nation are moving in this direction because they cannot afford such a great waste of resources. The fact is, there are a lot of states that are getting it. They're pursuing reforms that reduce prison populations, such as in Rhode Island, Michigan, and Texas. They're looking to reduce recidivism through innovative reentry programs, like in Maryland and Oregon. They're examining ways to more wisely spend limited funds available for indigent defense by creating oversight committees, like Maine's Commission on Indigent Legal Services and Alabama's proposed Office of Indigent Defense Services. In Alabama, this commission was proposed after it was discovered that 6 judge-appointed indigent defense attorneys collected more than 1/4 of the entire indigent defense budget in one county. Today's focus will focus on some of the efforts our panelists have been involved in or have studied at the state level, and what the federal government can learn from these experiences, both in its own policy and in helping to encourage other states to adopt such evidence-based measures. With that, I'd like to start with you, Justice Lake. One of the things that I mentioned in my introduction is that you were the founder and principal former of the actual Innocence Commission. Could you describe for us what the impetus for that commission was and sort of what its goals were when you formed it?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Let me first express my appreciation for allowing me to be on this distinguished panel. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. The Actual Innocence Commission, which was a study commission, which I formed in November 2002, is a result of my increasing concern throughout 2002 about the public's concern and the decline in the public trust and confidence in our court system and specifically our criminal justice system. And I was made aware by my good assistant here, Ms. Muma, of 2 specific cases that were very concerning. The Tim Garner case and the Ronald Cotton case, which is a very interesting case. I hope I can discuss that particular case a little bit more fully later on. But these 2 cases resulted from false eyewitness identification. So we got this commission together. I wrote an invitational letter to about 30 of the top criminal justice people throughout the state, including the Attorney General, the Director of the SBI, criminal defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, judges. There were 2 judges, one on the Supreme Court, one on the Superior Court, law enforcement officers, and we actually had several law professors on the commission. Every member of the commission accepted the invitation without any reluctance. I said in the letter that it was my firm belief that we had the best criminal justice system in the world, but it obviously was not perfect. And it was incumbent upon us to do what we could to improve the system. So we determined in that commission, that group, that met regularly about every 4 to 6 weeks, we determined that the first thing we needed to do was look at the causes of false convictions. And we determined after listening to a number of experts, including one from so far away as England, several around the country, Iowa, New Jersey, places like that. We got some very good input from these people, and we made a decided improvement in the procedure, the criminal procedure and the law enforcement procedure for eyewitness identification. So that was one of the first things we did, and I believe you admonished me to be brief in my answers, and notwithstanding my southern drawl, I will try to do so, and I'll cut it off.
Well, thank you, Justice Lake, and just to follow up, what has North Carolina's experience been since the actual Innocence Commission has made its recommendations in terms of addressing these issues?
Well, we studied the the things that were causing wrongful convictions first, and that took about, I would say, 4 to 6 months. We looked at eyewitness identification, as I said, and determined a new procedure for the law enforcement agencies around the state to adopt, and that was to look at the pictures of people of interest sequentially, not spread out in front of them all together, but each picture turned over one at a time by someone who did not know himself who was the suspected perpetrator. That was the double blind we had, because no matter how hard you try, they're going to get that feeling across to the witness that they think this is the one they ought to pay particular attention to. So we made that change, and that was adopted throughout North Carolina by law enforcement agencies, and also we recommended not photo ID, not photo recording, but recording of all interrogations of people of interest by the police.
Thank you, Justice Lake. I want to turn now to you, Director Wall. Obviously, prisons are high on people's minds, especially after the recent Supreme Court decision that I mentioned in my opening. What's Rhode Island's experience with reform? And I want to ask you particularly about the 2008 reform that Rhode Island adopted.
Sure, Chris. I should say that my department is a full-service adult correctional agency, meaning that we're responsible not only for the state's prisons, but also for its jails and its probation and its parole services. So we sort of have the full package of corrections. The 2008 reforms to which Chris refers were actually the product of failure. Some 25 years before Plata, there was a case called Palmagano, and it was a case in Rhode Island, a federal case. It involved conditions of confinement, Eighth Amendment allegations, just like California's, and it evolved into an overcrowding case, as the court concluded, just as the court did in Plata, that overcrowding compromised conditions of confinement in every way: security and safety, programming, health and mental health services, and so forth. The court set numerous deadlines for us to meet. I was with the department at the time. Numerous deadlines for us to meet in order to alleviate overcrowding. We failed to meet those deadlines, and in 1990, the federal court ordered the mass release of inmates in Rhode Island. And whereas California's been given a couple of years to accomplish it, the federal court in Rhode Island, in its frustration, ordered that it be done at once. And the result, of course, was that hundreds of both awaiting trial and sentenced inmates left abruptly. You can imagine there was a sense of deep anxiety on the part of the public as the streets were flooded by people who would have been incarcerated but for, and a sense that the system had failed. Meanwhile, we'd embarked on a massive building campaign, increased our bed space 50%, and a few years later, resolved the federal court order. Dial forward 10 years. All those beds were full, and we were overcrowded again. What had changed was this, that the state's leadership, which had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on building those additional beds and staffing those prisons, was broke. And there was no political appetite to try something that had failed all over again. The result was a different process was pursued this time, and it culminated in 2008. Specifically, it was a political process to solve a political problem, because overcrowding is, at the end of the day, not only a problem of the criminal justice system, but a problem of politics. and the way policy and politics in as volatile a world as ours, corrections, intersect. It was understood that what we needed to do this time was engage experts to look at what really drove the increase in corrections, what practices and policies were the source of this overcrowding, engage the state's political leadership and the leaders of the criminal justice system in listening to that analysis, and then working together through consensus and ultimately a lot of compromise in adopting some of the reforms that were proposed. 12 reforms were proposed by the experts convened by the Council of State Governments, funded by the Pew Foundation and by the Justice Department. 12 options were proposed. Only 3 of them passed because somebody in that circle, victims advocates, the prosecutors, the state police, the courts, objected to the other 9. The only ones with compromise that we reached consensus about were those 3. But those 3 did pass, and the results have been dramatic.
The results certainly have been dramatic. Director Wall, in 2009, it was reported that Rhode Island's prison population, the percentage of its prison population declined more than any other state in the country. It actually declined by 9%, which I think shows results. Could you describe what those 3 reforms were that led to that dramatic decline?
Sure. What we learned first and foremost was that the solutions have to be specific to a particular jurisdiction. What worked in Rhode Island wouldn't necessarily work in another state because every state has its own parole practices, its own sentencing scheme, its own bail setting rules. And so this is what worked in our state. It may or may not work in yours. What's more important than the specific practices that we put into place is that it be specific to a particular state's situation. In our state, there were 3. One was that by statute, we're allowed to award time off sentence for following the institutional rules. About 75% of the states have those what are called earned time rules. Incentive for inmates to follow the institutional rules and to develop pro-social attitudes. Problem was that Rhode Island's rules were upside down. If you were serving the longest sentences, presumably the heaviest kind of inmate, you could get as much as 33% off your sentence. If you were serving the lightest sentences, a jail population of serving, say, 30 days or a year, you got no time off your sentence. So sort of the heavier you were, the better, the sweeter the deal. What they did was standardize it so that even the inmates getting light sentences would have some incentive. And that, of course, accelerated releases of the inmates who were considered less of a risk. The second one was allowing incentives, time off sentence for program completion and participation. We used to have a kind of cafeteria-style approach to programming. We'd offer programs on anger management or substance abuse treatment or parenting skills, and if you were motivated and interested, you would enroll in them. And you would get virtually no time off your sentence as a result. What we did in Rhode Island was change that system so that you could now get time off your sentence if you participated and completed in the programs, but the corrections department would decide which programs you would complete, you would participate in and complete on the basis of assessing your risk. So inmates getting out earlier but better prepared for life after prison. And the third was a statutory mandate that the parole board use validated risk assessment in determining who should be released. I mean, this is not to criticize parole boards. They've grown up organically over the years, and they have tended in a lot of states to be political rewards for supporting leaders, political leaders. And there were still some members of our parole board that operated from the I can look them in the eye and tell philosophy of release. And this mandated that the members of the parole board use risk assessment instead of simply gut.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure
Can I ask a question that might be generalizable from your effort? Where did you base the research capacity into looking at these drivers and these possibilities for reform? Was that from the department, from the legislature, or some other body?
The politics in Rhode Island are like every other jurisdiction. There's some jockeying. The legislature and the governor don't always see eye to eye, sometimes don't necessarily accept one another's propositions, proposals, or conclusions. And there was, I think, some concern that if the Corrections Department did the research, it wouldn't be perceived as credible. Also, we're a big operational agency. Our sophistication doesn't lie in research. So what we used the money that we received from the Justice Department and the Pew Foundation to do was to engage national experts. In our case, it was Jim Austin took the lead. He's very well known for his work. He took the lead. He analyzed the data. He presented the results. And they were credible because they came from somebody who was neutral, who had no dog in the fight, and who everybody recognized knew his stuff.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your sort of pointing out the role of both sort of independent assessments and also the role that the Department of Justice in providing the support for that type of study to be performed, and the importance of that type of support. I think that's really important to sort of re-emphasize. Dr. Peel, I'd like to turn to you now. We've talked about making sure that the right people are in prison, and making sure that that prison population is managed in an effective and cost-efficient way. And so I'd like to turn to you to ask about reentry, because I know you've done some research and some work in the field of reentry. And a lot of people believe that collateral consequences have a big impact in terms of successful reentry. But you've seen other things that can act as barriers to successful reentry. So I'd be interested to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Thank you. And this will pick up, I think, a lot on what Director Wall just talked about. There's a large amount of work in the published out there now, easily found on the web, on the many, many challenges for prisoners when they are released from prison, and the challenges of moving from a very secure environment to essentially unfettered liberty, especially once coming from prison. The transition is large. There are a number of bans on activities that people can undertake, employment where people can live, et cetera. There's been a lot of work documenting those, and it's really pretty overwhelming, actually, when you start to read the long lists of challenges. I think many in the advocacy community have worked pretty hard to document those problems, and basically the result that you get from reading a lot of that literature is that we need a long, long legislative agenda to reverse those collateral consequences before it's going to be possible for inmates to make this transition. I wanted to come at the issue from a slightly different perspective, and that comes from spending time with corrections folks, right? People in corrections, I think, are the most pragmatic class of people that I've ever met, personally. They don't really always have the privilege to have a philosophy about what they're doing because they have such an operational challenge, as the director just stated. And what I'd found working in corrections is that oftentimes inmates would be able to find work if there were enough incentives around it. So if the incentive is you can live in a halfway house rather than inside secure confinement, people would be able to locate jobs and maintain them. So what I did is I spent some in-depth time at a program in Maryland, and the director of that program is here if people have follow-up questions for him, Stefan Labulio here. And what they're doing there in this pre-release center is thinking about really, really short-term consequences and getting the real near-term incentives right for inmates to get into employment and to make other kind of pro-social changes for them. This is a different approach from the kind of more labor market approaches, perspective that people take, a lot of people in my field take, that think about we need wage subsidies, job search assistance, training, et cetera. This is really about getting people into work right away. And the kind of incentives that they're using are just real accountability things that might come naturally to people people like us who have a lot of social supports and reinforcements, but for a number of people who don't have those kind of real near-term incentives. So, to be concrete, one of the things they do is, if you don't have a job, you need to search for a job all day. So there's no TV option, there's no alternative behavior. 8 to 4:30, you're looking for a job. Once you find a job and get a placement, then you have things like a later curfew. You have more just general, the restrictions on your life are reduced. And they do another thing, and that is offering positive social support, which I think is really important for a lot of people who find themselves in heavy-duty contact with the criminal justice system. They make signs, they celebrate these achievements, et cetera. And what's impressive about the work here is that people find work. At release, 86% of their of the inmates in this pre-release center have work. They have 60 days experience on average, and they have the positive feedback right there that's about a kind of a real work first perspective. And I think what I tried to emphasize and highlight by writing up my experience viewing this program is that these accountability systems provide a very different kind of approach. It's really pragmatic. It's really right now, and it has the ability to function very well.
Dr. Peel, I had a question for you. I remember the piece that you wrote, I believe, called "The Value of Small Rewards." And it was eye-opening for us because our staff had a tendency to kind of poo-poo those solutions, thinking, these are people, the guys you're talking about, men and women, but mostly men, they've been around the block a lot. They can be pretty tough and pretty hardened. And the so-called small incentives, things like celebrating somebody's accomplishment or giving them a later curfew, the perception that's kind of Mickey Mouse when you consider the kinds of people that you're dealing with and that they're not really going to be taken seriously. That was not your experience, is that right? And I'm interested that it wasn't.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the concern, right? It's downright paternalistic, okay? But it's not Mickey Mouse. So I would agree with part of the impetus behind that. It's paternalistic. I also think that locking somebody up in their cell and telling them, when they can eat and where they can go is paternalistic. So I consider this to be, just the kind of things, the kind of paternalism you would use for, a younger brother who's having trouble getting his act together. So it is downright paternalistic. I would also, I don't want to put too fine a gloss on it. Maybe 10, 15% of the people are just not going to respond to this. You are going to have some poor behavior. You're going to have some non-response. And you have to have, obviously, systems for that. One can always get returned to county lockup or something if it really comes to that. I know you have options for dealing with poor behavior. The thing that's amazing to me is that at the time, Montgomery County had 30% of their detained population in this pre-release setting where inmates were expected to be out of the facility for 8 to 10 hours a day, working, attending community AA meetings and the like, okay? So it's working for not a narrow slice of the selected population and not 100%, but it's working for a substantial part of the population without risk to the community, okay? The final point is that it's not cheap. Paternalism of this kind of sort is more expensive than the straight lockup paternalism, and I don't know if the program can succeed in the same way as budgets have tightened up. So my research was a couple of years ago.
So, Dr. Peel, obviously there are economic benefits to successful reentry. Successful reentry results in lower recidivism rates, which result in savings based on avoided incarceration. And you talk about sort of work being a necessary component in making certain that these people find work so that they sort of have a purpose. But given that, and this may be a question that you can't answer, so I apologize in advance for putting you on the spot, but given that real unemployment at this point is at something around 16%, and given that there are lots of people who haven't been to prison who are looking for jobs, how is it that former inmates who are looking to sort of become productive members of society find those opportunities? And if they don't find those opportunities, are there alternatives that can still prevent recidivism while acknowledging the fact that it's just tough to find a job?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I think work is important for people's sense of purpose and structure in their life, as well as for the financial resources that it provides. And I also agree with you that there are many, many people who haven't committed crimes who are struggling very, very much in this environment. And it's the incarcerated population is usually sort of the last on the totem pole in the economy. When we were having the successes of the economy earlier in the decade, you had work placement, the work first programs, et cetera, were really looking for people to help get into work. After welfare reform, they'd work through the welfare reform population more or less. And so it's going to be a population that's going to be kind of the least successful. I think one can still try to implement a system of accountability, but just be a little more understanding that it's going to be harder to actually judge on the outcomes. So you can still encourage the work, you can still reward the pro-social effort, you can focus a little bit more on other parts of one's recovery, whether it's AA or skill accession or something like that. But it's a real practical concern.
Great, thank you. And now I'd like to turn to you, Mr. Keene. So I think that obviously, as I mentioned in my introduction, you're one of the original signatories to Right on Crime. Right on Crime has garnered a lot of interest because there are people in some corners who found it surprising to hear conservative voices speaking out about criminal justice reform and the need to address some of the problems with the criminal justice system. But I think that there are other people who would say there's always been a place for a conservative voice expressing ideas about how to improve the system. So why is it that these influential conservatives, including yourself, decided that now was the time to speak out and really highlight that conservative perspective on criminal justice reform?
Well, it isn't so much now. We've been involved. The Right on Crime initiative was announced this year. For the last 2 or 3 years, I, along with a number of other leading conservatives, have been involved in a conservative criminal justice reform project and a series of meetings to try to determine what needs to be done. And if you look at all of these problems, they're all at base political. Over-criminalization is a result of political considerations. It's too attractive in many cases for a politician not to want to punish someone or to take it out on someone. And so we have laws against things that 30 years ago we didn't have laws against and that nobody would have considered criminal. At the federal level, we've criminalized everything. Every time there's something that goes on, some congressman pops up on television and says, we ought to have a federal law against that. My favorite, of course, is the carjacking law. It was already illegal to steal someone's car with them or without them being in it, but Congress decided, no, this should be a federal criminal offense as well as a state criminal offense, and the list goes on and on. That is a political problem. Prosecutors love to use their office to look for higher office. Many prosecutors, not most prosecutors, but many prosecutors are elected. And they don't see the job that they have as the end of the road for them. They see it as a step along the road to bigger and better things, and as a consequence, they're constantly looking for ways to burnish their prosecutorial record. I'm always amazed. I was most amazed, I think, going back to what our first speaker said or accomplished in North Carolina when I testified in Congress when we were attempting to get the system to allow DNA after conviction evidence. And the prosecutorial committee said no. The community was saying basically no, finality is more important than justice. And we argued that you could have both, and that if it was only going to cost you $12.95 to find out whether the guy actually ought to be executed, for example, wouldn't you sleep better at night if you spent the money? A lot of particularly politically motivated prosecutors said, no, I'd sleep better at night knowing no one ever would question my judgment. They didn't say that explicitly, but that's what they were saying. And then what happens, and what's happened over the years, and this is that, as is the case with many public policy issues, what you really get is a false argument or a false set of positions. And both sides in each of those arguments is partially responsible for allowing that to happen. So that those who have favored many of the reforms that all of us might support have managed over the years to position themselves as sort of friends of the criminal, and have argued that what they're doing is advocating for criminals or for offenders, as if the moment that you rob the 7-Eleven, you become a victim of society or something and are therefore treated as a victim. Others suggest that no matter what happens after you're apprehended, if you've robbed the 7-Eleven, doesn't matter. So that once you go to prison, the longer the better. There's no reason to even think about it. So that what happens is really under the radar in terms of the public consciousness. And if someone raises problems about, particularly during the period of incarceration, most of the public says, well, the guy probably deserved it anyway. So what the heck? Why should we worry about that? Why should we spend more money? Why should we care if they're crowded into cells, or if they don't get the services that are needed, or if there's all of this crime that goes on because the institutions are overcrowded and badly run? What's the problem? Why do we care? That's a political problem, and it either means you don't have the political will to in a disciplined way look at who ought to be in prison and who ought not to be in prison, and look at everybody there as the same, nor do you have the political will that if you're going to lock all of these people up, that you're going to go out and ask for the money that it costs to keep them there under something approaching civilized conditions. So while it's a mistake to, in our view, it's a mistake to view the criminal as victim, it's also a mistake once the criminal is convicted, the offender is convicted, to turn him into a victim, which is what happens in many institutions. And all of these problems are political, and many of them are complicated because the temptation to try to get the carjacking law, for example, repealed. You won't, because somebody will stop and say, you know, you like carjackers, for God's sakes. You know, are you against that? And then and I think the work that Professor Peel's is doing is so important, because the other problem is what happens, and this is the societal cost of mistreating, is the societal cost of giving people a criminal record who may not need to have gotten a criminal record, and then incarcerating them in a way that does nothing but reinforce their worst instincts, and then letting them out into a society in which it's virtually impossible or very difficult for them to succeed. But the solutions to some of those problems are complicated. I remember at one of our meetings, the easy thing is what you were talking about earlier, is a subsidy for a job, or do all these different things. And I remember Bob Woodson from the district, who many here may know, said, wait a minute, you know, I agree with you, but what's the message you're sending to somebody who didn't go to jail in that community, when the fellow who just got out has got better chances, or is being given preference over them, and they can't get a job? So I think what we all recognized is that these problems are serious. They are at base political, and if you're going to solve them politically, you have to do through a group like the Constitution Project, which I find so important, because what the Constitution Project tries to do is bring people from all political perspectives together and try to develop a consensus on real solutions to real problems, rather than involve themselves in a continuing debate which pits one straw man after another. So I don't find, I think the role of conservatives in this debate, in this argument, in this effort to reform things is essential, because it has to be demonstrated that these concerns are across-the-board concerns. And we are at a time now, I'm not going to say that the problems are worse now than they've been, but we're at a time now when governors in particular, strapped for money, living in a world in which in many states, next to education, the single greatest expenditure they have is on their criminal justice system and on the costs of incarceration, when they're looking at it and saying, now who ought to be in prison, who ought not to be, what are the alternatives, and what is the purpose of all this? And the purpose of all this is to protect the society. And both sides need to realize that at the outset, and then what contributes to and doesn't contribute to that. And it's not always the obvious answer. So I think it's I think we're at a very important time. I think we can do some nobody can fix the world, politics being what it is, but you can make the world a little bit better. And the sort of stars are aligning in a way that allows people to work together and focuses attention on these problems that wasn't focused before the current economic crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Justice Lake, I wanted to come back to you. In the news recently, there's been discussion about North Carolina in particular and the budget cuts that are affecting indigent defense providers. In North Carolina, there have been proposals that would reduce the per-hour payments to these attorneys to less than what they claim is their overhead. So they'd be taking cases at a loss. And I want to ask you, and I should mention that there are some providers who have stated that they'll stop taking appointments. And I want to ask you, even though there is a short-term, perhaps there is a short-term budgetary benefit to cutting indigent defense in terms of the bottom line, you have a more balanced budget. Is there a cost to the criminal justice system when those types of cuts are pursued? Does it create inefficiencies that actually end up costing the system more in the long run?
Well, definitely. I think that is the case, and I don't really see any short-term benefit. I think the impact is virtually immediate. We've seen that already with a number of very good attorneys who previously took these cases, taking their names off the list. They refused to perform this service anymore. When I was a Superior Court judge, I know it was a long time before I was able to get any money at all to the attorney defending in a particular case. And now that is certainly going to be worse, and the money is going to be totally inadequate compared to what that attorney could earn in the private sector. So the impact is going to be immediate, and it's going to result in many cases being overturned on the basis of inadequate assistance of counsel. So that's going to be a very serious effect. It's going to affect cost, and I hope we're working, I think, night and day at this point to persuade the legislature not to take that money away from the indigent defense services. They perform a very vital service, so that's the situation now in North Carolina, and I hope we can turn it around. That's just one example of inadequate funding by the legislature for the judicial system. They seem to fail to realize that the justice branch is a co-equal branch of government, and really worth as much as they are. It's the whole foundation of our society. They can't seem to realize that. They cannot seem to adequately fund the system. The entire judicial system in North Carolina now gets about 2% of all the money available to the state of North Carolina. 3% would be probably acceptable, so we're not asking for much money. But compared to other agencies, other branches. But it's imperative that we get adequate funding. When I was Chief Justice, I got some considerable attention when I announced that I was going to stop the trial of all civil cases until we could catch up with the criminal cases. Some of these criminal cases were running 3 to 4 years behind, with the accused sitting in jail for that period of time before trial. They're totally unacceptable. So that caused quite a stir among the civil attorneys. They couldn't at all agree to that approach. And so I also suggested I might just close the courthouse entirely on Fridays and see how they like that. But, I got some more money, and that was successful. Unfortunately, we're not pursuing that course now, and I do not know what's going to happen. But we've got to do something about the inadequate funding of our system.
Thank you. I'd like to open up the panel to questions from the audience. I know that we have our 2 volunteers with microphones, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and they'll bring you the mic. In the meantime, Director Wall, I just want to ask you, there are news reports that Governor Brown, in response to the Supreme Court decision, one of his plans for addressing the overcrowding and reducing the prison population is to transfer some of those prisoners into county and local jails. Is this the silver bullet that everyone has been looking for?
Well, I think I can speak from our perspective, since, as I happened to mention at the beginning of our session, our department is responsible not only for the prisons, but for the jails, those serving short sentences and those awaiting trial. And what I can say in our state is that when the overcrowding orders were issued, the court simply expanded them to cover the jails as well, because as we were trying to keep the prison population down, we had backed up people in the jails to the point where they were overcrowded and presenting Eighth Amendment issues. So it may work for Governor Brown, but I'm not sure it's going to work for the state of California.
It's an important distinction there, I think. So do we have any questions from the audience?
My name is Howard Wooldridge. I'm a member of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. To the justice who just said that the problem was of inadequate funding, have you ever thought to the original problem of why people come to the court in the first place? As a detective, 70% of my felony caseload touch crimes associated with drug prohibition, war on drugs. Have you or have spoken to any of your colleagues or others recently as to perhaps looking at that policy, which would alleviate and reduce many of the reasons that most of us are here today?
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your question. Yes, we have. We established drug treatment courts some years ago with moderate success. We needed more follow-up by outside professionals than we were able to get with strictly the court personnel, but we have attempted these alternative courts, and with some varying degrees of success. So, to give you a short answer, yes, we have considered that.
Get a microphone up front.
Yeah. My name is Charlie Sullivan, and I direct a grassroots prison reform organization called CURE. I guess I just have maybe 2 sets of questions. First of all, does the panel believe that we need a vehicle to bring about changes, as many of you brought about, in particular Judge Lake and Director Hall in your state? Do we need that on the federal level? The only vehicle that I see is the web bill that seems to be dying a slow death. And unless we do this, do we just basically miss this golden opportunity that you're talking about, and that we continue on and have panels like this and have basically no overhaul of the system, but basically kind of piecemeal things? Is that the only alternative? So I'm just, where do we go from here is what I'm asking in regard to the federal level.
Well, let me say this. I think, excuse me, I think we need to quit talking so much about it in eloquent terms and lay out some specifics that I think are attainable right now and follow through. I think we need less rhetoric and more direct action to.
But Judge, a vehicle, what would be the
Yes.
vehicle? Would it be the creating of a crime commission that we've been working on?
Yes, that would certainly be one vehicle if that commission had some teeth, some clout, but not otherwise.
If I can add something, we should never, while that would be great, we should never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And while it may not be possible to get everything, and indeed it might be impossible to get widespread agreement on everything, that doesn't mean that if you take a look, for example, at the recommendations of the Smarter on Crime report for this year, if you got half of them, if you got if you did them individually, that would be better than sitting and having panels. So I think I don't think we should, it's fine to say we ought to have an overall reform vehicle. That would be the best thing in the best of all possible worlds. But on the other hand, there are opportunities and there are people in Congress and in the states who might be willing to champion some of these things that might not be willing to get onto the whole thing. So I think we should look at it in both ways. The way you're talking about, that's fine, but also reform in this country generally comes about piecemeal, and getting those pieces adopted is just as important and sometimes more important.
I think we have a question from our remote audience.
Is it working?
Experiencing some technical problems.
I'm allowed to join the grown-ups. Thank you very much. My name is Fran Bantman. I teach and research criminal justice at George Washington University, and I have two questions from different perspectives. The first is, I really appreciate that almost everyone has emphasized the politics behind criminal justice problems of various kinds. But sooner or later, in probably more than one jurisdiction, somebody who is released under some reform or other is going to do something really terrible. And one's going to have the kind of Willie Horton dynamic where somebody blames the politician who was behind that reform. And I'd be interested in how you all would advise people who are in politics who want to champion reform efforts as to how they can deal with what will be some negative consequences amid the many more arguably and hopefully good consequences. That's my first question. My second question is actually directed to people like myself who do research, and it would also apply to people in the policy research community as well as academia. What do you think the top agenda items are that people should be working on? To what extent should it be, like Professor Peel's work, actually looking at programs, that work? To what extent should it be looking at the politics and coalition formation? To what extent should it be comparing between and among the states? And I'm sure you could add your own. I'd just be really curious what you think the imperatives are. Thank you.
if I could figure this out. I'd make a general response. I think that if anyone politically approaches these problems from the perspective that what he or she is trying to do is improve a system that will be more effective in protecting the society. After all, there are some people in prison who should never be freed, in a cell next to people who shouldn't even be there. And so the question is, how do you reduce the population? What are the problem with the laws? And the public, and there is data on this, the public at this point is a little concerned about the fact that everything's becoming criminal. So you can picking and choosing or forming something to look at that, you can do things without suffering political consequences. Secondly, as you gauge these things and as you look at it, why would the public want to adopt reforms? To make the public safer. So if there are reforms that result in lower recidivism and the like, you can show, that can be shown empirically as something that not only pays dividends but is fair and just and serves their first. If everybody had all the, we were joking beforehand, I said, you know, if governments had all the money in the world and you just wanted to simple-mindedly deal with most of the crime, you could just, whenever anybody did something wrong, you could lock them up till they were 35. And that would solve 90% of the crime. That's not a very sensible way to go about it. But when you look at the cost of the criminal justice system, you might have some people would say, well, it's expensive. Maybe we do need to pay more money to build more prisons. Maybe we do need to hire more prison guards. But if it works, fine. But if it doesn't work, then it's no different than the money we put into schools that fail. You know, Pat Nolan, who isn't here today, who does work with the Prison Fellowship, said, you know, wouldn't it be interesting, this is not a costly thing, if in promoting people within the system, wardens and the like, if one of the criteria was what was the recidivism rate on their watch at that institution versus the watch before. If we can hold teachers accountable, why can't we hold corrections officials accountable? I mean, there are a whole, my point simply is that I have always in politics operated on the assumption that if you talk sense to people, they respond, because people are not stupid. If you don't talk sense, if you are operating at a different sort of a demagogic level, they'll drop to that level and make their decisions based on the way you're talking to them. But the fact of the matter is that people see there's a problem. And the average American, when he looks at the fact that we've got this many people in prisons, it's costing this much money, and doesn't seem to be doing anything, that's a person that's ripe to have a conversation about how you improve the system. So I don't think it's as, this isn't 1968. This isn't 1969 when you couldn't say anything other than lock them up and throw away the key. This is a time when they say, okay, we locked them up, we threw away the key, and now they're all getting out, and it's costing us all this money, and what good is it doing? I mean, the American people are very practical, and I think if you approach them practically, that's why your empirical research is so important, and you say, here's something that works and here's something that doesn't work, they'll listen to that. If you say, on the other hand, I'm here because I want to make prisoners happier or make them more comfortable or do this, they'll say, we really don't care about that. The practical fact is they want to know what works.
Professor, I'd like to speak to your first point about what I would call the notorious exception, the case that is not necessarily the norm, but that evokes such fear and anger that it can shape decision-making from that point on. I mean, it is true that there are few subjects as highly charged and volatile as correctional policy. And I understand that as somebody who started in a line position, as this has been my entire career. I mean, what could be more important to people than their sense of personal safety for themselves and that of their loved ones? And you can try to argue in the midst of the uproar for a rational perspective, but it really does trigger something different in the brain. I mean, even I, who am a professional, find myself rising to outrage when I start reading about a particular case. And I mean, I will also say that on a personal level, for somebody who is in this line of work, there are few things more searing and painful than being involved in a decision that results in that kind of outcome. It is something that, that you never forget it. And I think for those reasons, my wife has an expression, sometimes you have to strike while the iron is cold, meaning before everything heats up and everybody's in an uproar and things are really, sentiment is really aroused, you need to make decisions that are thoughtful, inclusive, owned broadly. That involves a lot of compromise. As Mr. Keene said, the perfect is the enemy of the good. But you set the rules in place not in response to an event like this or not even in anticipation of an event. And I think that's one thing that the leaders of our state did well. They agreed among themselves that they were going to come to consensus on some portion of the recommendations. But then once they had come to that consensus, they were all going to own them. They would not break ranks. They would not try to score political points. And the solutions they made were policy solutions. So that, and when the case goes bad, you can't find one person to blame because everybody owned it, and they owned it through policy and political processes. And the decisions that were made were the results of that process. So I really do think it argues for doing this hard work, getting everybody at the table, respecting each other's points of view, compromising and putting away the things that somebody says I can't accept in order to blunt the impact of that kind of case.
I agree with that completely. One of the reasons that something can be done now, remember I said this isn't the late 60s. And going to your point about the emotionalism, in the late 60s and the 70s when crime rates were very high, you couldn't have much discussion. It says, what more can we do to put these people away? Now crime rates are low. Even with the recession, they're not growing. So the fact is, now is indeed the time when the iron is cold and when you can fix things. So I think that's exactly right.
I mean, many a politician's career, many a public official's career has foundered on the shoals of controversial corrections outcome. And I think it was one reason why our state's leadership, and they don't always agree and they don't always play nice with one another, recognized that they were all in this one together. Because if they didn't act, the state would not be able to afford the correctional system at a time of fiscal crisis, and they therefore had to come to consensus so that they would not score points against one another. I'm sorry? Dr. Peel, do you have a comment on that? Not to put you on the spot again.
Oh, no, I thought Mr. Keene sort of responded to that by saying that I think that in support of the types of things people are talking about here, which is different than, broader kind of academic agenda, I think the work that's as specific as possible to a particular jurisdiction and then tied to its institutional particularities, which are many, and that can then be used to map into some kind of policy reform is the most useful. I would just say a couple of other barely related comments, since you've given me the opportunity. One is, I think we're learning a lot less from research about criminal justice than would be desirable, because the states are so different from each other, right? The states are so different, it can be really hard to generalize from one to another. So as kind of a longer term agenda, I think that there's some work for academic researchers to try to collect the tough data, to really characterize different states and try to make data systems more comparable so that reliable cross-state kind of comparisons can be made down the road. And perhaps that's something that BJS can really help with supporting some kind of data norms and collections to really facilitate that. Because we have a lot going on in the states, but it can be really hard to generalize from one to the other because you can't even really compare one state's population to another except in the broadest kind of aggregates. So I would think that's an area that we can think of as kind of a medium run kind of agenda.
Thanks. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and just ask a question to all of our panelists. We're sitting here, obviously, we've discussed how unique each state's criminal justice system is and the unique requirements and problems that they face. But we are here in the Capitol Visitor Center, and we're talking to a lot of people who work either in the federal government or with the federal government. Are there things that the federal government can do to help support the states in their reform efforts, beyond just learning the lessons that these states have provided and applying them to the extent that they work on the federal system? Are there things that the federal government can do to help states pursue reform? Is that a no? Go right ahead.
Criminal justice has traditionally been perceived as essentially a state and local problem. It's relatively rare for Congress to insert itself into criminal justice policy, with the exception of the kinds of occasions that Mr. Keene has noted, where there's a feeling that you need to federalize something in order for your constituents to see that you've reacted to it. I think two initiatives that I find very heartening, where the federal government has taken an active role, have been first the Second Chance Act, which speaks to what Dr. Peel had described about prisoner reentry. I mean, the fact is that 34% of the offenders released from sentences in our jurisdiction every year are back in our custody on new sentences within 12 months. Now, I've been in corrections a long time, and I'm not naive. There are people who are committed to a criminal lifestyle, and they will return. But on the other hand, when that many come back that quickly, there's something wrong with the process, whereby you go from this highly structured environment where we make all the decisions and you follow all the rules, to a life full of choices, chaos, complications. Something is wrong with that transition, and the Second Chance Act eases it. I would also say that another one that I think is very promising is the Justice Reinvestment Act, which recognizes, and I think it's no accident that my state senator is one of the lead sponsors, because that's in essence the process that was followed with private money, foundation money, and some justice money in our state. And it's really seed money, relatively small amounts, that equip the individual jurisdiction to understand what exactly is going on in our state that's causing our population to rise. Dr. Peel's point was well taken. The answers are different in every state. You've got to have a state-specific set of research data. But once you've got it, you can implement it. The point is that the states, we can't run deficits in the states. Money is in short supply. A relatively modest amount of money that funds the kind of research in a state that helps us figure out why our population is growing and what changes we could make in our own states to change it. That's a really good reinvestment. That's a really good investment, especially if the dollars are saved and reinvested in things like prisoner reentry.
Yeah, here we go. Two examples. In reform of anything, institutions as a whole tend to be relatively foot-dragging in terms of what they're doing. The Second Chance Act is a wonderful example, passed in the Congress and signed with liberal and conservative support. At the federal level, the Bureau of Prisons is not very enthusiastic, and I'm putting it euphemistically, about the Second Chance Act, and is not very anxious to use it and has dragged its feet in its implementation. Secondly, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which required, I believe, that of last June, that the Justice Department issue finalized rules after investigation. If you go back and look at this, originally the Justice Department took the position that prison rape was essentially an urban myth that people believed in because they watched Law and Order or something on television, and sort of rejected all the numbers. Finally, they did their own studies and found out that there were 60, 70,000 prison rapes a year going on, and yet because of objections within the department, the deadline passed without the Attorney General initiating the rules, although some states adopted the recommendations and in fact have had tremendous results in terms of eliminating rapes in the prisons. I've taken the position that from the end of June, when he was required to do that, knowing for a fact that rapes are taking place in the prisons, the Attorney General of the United States is an accessory before and after the fact for every forcible rape that takes place on his watch, because he could have stopped a large percentage of them. The fact is that institutions, regardless of the fact that they include many good people, tend not to like change. And what can be done at the federal system is, one, assist things in the states that are going well, set some standards, and then look to their own house. Because while the Bureau of Prisons overall does a pretty good job, that good job isn't done every day, every week of every year.
Thanks. I guess we'll take some more audience questions. We've got somebody up here.
Thanks. Jody Kent-Levy from the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. I actually, surprisingly, have a question about youth sentencing. I am interested to get a sense from all of you how you see youth sentencing, particularly sentencing youth as adults, fitting into the picture of reducing costs on the state level. I know in North Carolina, 16 and 17-year-olds are automatically tried as adults. And I know Rhode Island a few years ago was exploring holding 17-year-olds in the adult facilities and then retracted that because of the costs associated with it, thankfully. But I'm interested to hear from all of you sort of how you see youth sentencing and juvenile justice fitting into that picture of reducing costs on the state level.
Well, I'll just frame it a little bit, and then I think I might turn it to A.T. Wall to answer, because I think he's the best posed to this, from my understanding. I think that the questions that you're interested in are important, perhaps most important for other purposes than cost, actually. So, I mean, I'm an economist. I think costs matter. I'm interested in the allocation of resources, but I think the issues about youth sentencing are more usefully, more appropriately addressed from other kinds of concerns like justice, for example. My understanding is that the use of adult sentences for youth has decreased quite a bit over the last few years, but I think on the cost side, A.T. Wall has the most relevant experience about shifting 17-year-olds to the adult system, right? And what the consequences for that, since the original impetus was designed as a cost-saving measure, right?
Let me, you mentioned the Ronald Cotton case. Let me mention the cost, not just in terms of dollars, but the impact on society as a whole. The Ronald Cotton case, as I said, was a very unique case. The victim, the young lady, a college student, was accosted in her own apartment, and she determined, unlike I think most women in these circumstances throughout the attack, she was going to focus on what was happening and not try to put her mind somewhere else. She was determined that she was going to put that man behind bars. She was going to make him pay. And as a result of that determination, she did make a young man pay. Unfortunately, it was the wrong man. She had observed her attacker for over 2 hours in her apartment, including a lighted kitchen. And she studied him diligently, every feature. And when the wrong man was arrested, she identified him in court twice. Yes, that is the man who raped me. That trial was overturned, came back again. She said, yes, the man sitting over there is the man who raped me. Now, while he was in jail for 17 years, the man who actually raped her raped 3 other women. Now, that is a direct cost on on society, and that has a dramatic impact on our criminal justice system and the public's trust and confidence in that system. So it's extremely important that we make these improvements, and I think we are beginning to do that in specific areas like the Innocence Inquiry Commission, which has been very successful in North Carolina in, I think, reducing costs and reducing crime.
Thank you, Justice Lake. Director Wall?
Sure. We, like many states, have some youth who are waived into the adult system by the family court on the basis of their criminal histories and the nature of their offenses. We did have the experience a few years ago in which the General Assembly changed the age of majority so that whereas you used to have committed your crime the 18th birthday or above, any crimes committed at the 17th birthday would automatically result in sentences to the adult institution. So that created actually, given that those are the crime-prone years, that led to quite an influx into our system. It was designed as a cost-saving measure because the per-head cost in training schools is very high, higher than the per-head cost in correctional institutions for adults. Nobody had asked the corrections department how the math worked in practice. And our position is that because whenever somebody who is under the age of 18 is committed to our custody, they go into protective custody because they are either physically not as mature or emotionally and intellectually not as well developed to be able to fend for themselves in the general population, and our job is to keep everybody safe. And protective custody, especially at the highest levels of security, which is where we wanted to put these juveniles, is of course more expensive than the average cost for an inmate, and therefore it turned out to be a net increase in costs. So that was the way that calculus played out. I will say that from our point of view, I think we are concerned when juveniles are sentenced to the adult system across the board. We're concerned about them, and the tendency is to put those kids in protective custody. It is more expensive. We don't necessarily like the idea that kids are coming into our systems, but I mean, we have an ironclad no refusal policy. I mean, we can never say no. If the court says you have to go there, we have to take you in, and then our job is to make it work. One sort of interesting footnote in the law of unintended consequences. We put the juveniles in protective custody because we were, and I think rightly so, concerned about their vulnerability for a variety of reasons, and also because we wanted to protect them and make sure that they were unharmed. But the juveniles in the system reached a level at which they were a significant portion of the protective custody population, and kids in custody do what kids do everywhere. They affiliate with one another, they form their own groups, they hang together, they form their own posse, and what we found were they were preying on the adult protective custody inmates while they were in our system. And so from that point of view, we were also relieved when the law was changed, and we didn't have to worry about that outcome.
Thank you, Director Wall. It looks like we're about out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming. I especially want to thank our four panelists. We really appreciate your taking the time to come out here and discuss these important issues and to raise some interesting questions, as well as provide some very interesting answers. I'd like to remind everybody, if they want more information about what we discussed today or any of the other Smart on Crime recommendations, please fill out your card and either leave them with one of the volunteers at the door or in the basket by the printed materials. Thank you very much.
Thank you.